So a lot of times I think about like just by accident topics that we can talk about because ultimately it's like if you're in a grocery store and you see like 800 shampoos, like which one do you pick kind of a thing. And eventually you're just like, that one looks like good enough. So that's where I've kind of arrived with these. And a lot of the times they come about naturally. And I like how this topic came into my head because it ties in nicely to another topic that I was thinking about that we should talk about. And so just a little backstory, like you ever had, I'm assuming you've had a canker before, like
Mm.
a canker sore in your mouth. You never had a canker?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Put the two words together, it like resonates with me.
Okay.
Canker
Okay.
and sore, but like just the canker by itself. Yeah, yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah. Okay. So I used to get a lot of cankers as a younger child. I'm still technically a child, relative to some people, but I still occasionally get cankers. Okay. And when I was much younger, I was never able to perceive the onset of a canker. But the older that I've gotten, the more I pay attention to that onset, or rather, the more I'm able to draw my attention to that onset. And I don't know if this is just in my head or what, but we'll just go with it as a story and as a paradigm because it makes sense, which is now that I'm able to better perceive when I'm feeling like a little bit of tiny soreness that is of a similar sensation to like a really bad canker, and I can kind of feel like it's at a 10 or 20% formation. What I do is I intentionally just cut my brushing time down. So if I'll usually brush for 2 or 3 minutes, I'll brush less than that and I'll use less toothpaste. And inevitably, what has tended to happen is when I've started to employ that strategy, the I can tell that the canker it's starting to form and it's getting a little worse. And when I recognize it and I cut down the brushing volume, it actually dissipates and it never fully forms because the more that it gets irritated, the worse that it gets. And this got me thinking about a conversation that you and I have had many times, but especially more recently with a lot of the spine stuff specific to you, is you've gotten so much better at recognizing the onset of, the metaphorical canker, where, you start to, the more that you pay attention, the more that you can sense like when it's starting to become more of an actual problem. And I think that when it comes to the conversation around like something like deloads or like stress management, volume management, a lot of it is very reactive. And a lot of it is like, let's figure out how we pick up the pieces rather than how do we start, what kinds of things can we better start to pay attention to along the way so that we don't actually have to get to that point. Because me personally, outside of like an intentional stop to training, I would generally think that one might be able to make better progress longer term if you don't have to go through so many of those periods of, you're spending a week either totally off of the gym or a week in a period where, you're doing so little volume that it's like you're fine recovering, but like you're not pushing past the point that you maybe would have got to otherwise. And then tying into this, I wanted to talk a little bit about however it seems to fit your conversation with Mike Israetel that you had a couple days ago, and just to kind of hear what your thoughts were on that and that exchange, because I'm sure a lot of people listening know who Mike is, and Mike, for context, came into the gym that Ethan and I work at on Friday or Saturday or Thursday, one of those days. And you two had a discussion, and I think it was in relationship to some failure stuff, volume stuff. I think it'll connect. So just as a starting point, that's kind of the maybe what I'm envisioning in terms of the trajectory of this conversation, but wherever it goes, it goes. But just any comments from you on that concept of, paying a little bit more attention to what you observe to kind of be your fatigue markers. And just as an additional aside, another example of this I have observed a lot in an alternate scenario or an alternate context is specifically with powerlifters. What I've noticed is because I've worked with powerlifters who have been training for a week, and I've also worked with powerlifters who have been doing it for over a decade or more, and who are super advanced and kind of at the top of their game. And what I noticed with the guys who are much more advanced is that they have basically like a list of like 1 to 3 things that on their body they're able to point to, where when they start to notice a little bit of like we'll say a decrease in performance, that usually comes, on a little bit of a longer timeline. But usually the first thing that they notice is like, oh, this adductor thing, on the left side of my hip tends to like start to talk to me. And so that's when I kind of know, maybe in a previous, mesocycle where I would have gotten hurt, or maybe I would have, at least strained it. I can really just back off early and I can kind of push forward from that point. So what have those kinds of things been for you, just as, the longer you've gone on in your training journey? And then in addition to that, what kinds of, recommendations or just any general thoughts on the topic would you give to people who are maybe looking to start to better themselves in that domain of like just learning more about their particular quirks and as it relates to the sensations that generally come up that are maybe seemingly minor, but over the longer run play kind of a bigger role? Just kind of interested to see where you go with that.
Yeah, I think it's kind of appropriate timing right now, actually, because I'm nearing the end of a block right now that we planned for about 14 weeks. So I'm just finishing week 12 now. And some of those things are starting to creep up. Nothing orthopedically, actually. So, you were mentioning the low back. And there's definitely some signs there that previously, I would try to get rid of, maybe through kind of like, stretching it out, so to speak, or just like, trying to do manual therapy, just trying to actively do things to get rid of it versus just kind of noting it and, accepting it. And I think that's a big part of it, right? Is like, once you become aware that this is like a symptom and it's supposed to be there, in a sense, like it's not something that is, by accident. It's not something that happened while you were sleeping last night. That's a really common one where people are like, oh, I slept on my shoulder wrong. My back hurts today, so I just must have slept on it wrong. Usually if you can look back on what happened in the, 24, 48 hours before, there's some clues outside of just, for some reason that night you just slept on it wrong. I'm not saying that never happens, but probably like
yeah. Maybe if it's a new bed or new pillow, understandable.
So here's a really good example in like the last 48 hours. Again, I'm in the last, few weeks of a training block now, and this is a very typical example of like how I'll feel. So today's Sunday, and like I'm, prepping for the week, right? I'm like, doing supplements, food, drugs, etc. I have some stuff, to prepare for work. Just kind of like going through the to-do list, getting everything ready for the week. And earlier, in a meso, maybe I don't have that sense of like impending kind of like anxiety about shit. I got to get like a lot done. I'm, really behind. And it just kind of like, there's this overall just anxious feeling of like, feeling behind.
Mm-hmm.
And then, yesterday, as a training day on Saturday, like I did a full day of work, and then I have, my own training session after that. And I find like, as a training block goes on, especially on like a Saturday, just, towards the end of the week, as I've accumulated a week of work, a week of training, week of, just lifestyle stressors, it takes longer and longer for me to get up for training, to basically like, get my stuff together, like just, do all the preparation that I need, to get ready for training. So I just end up like moving slower, like it requires more stimulants or more louder music, or it's just this kind of like procrastination that ends up happening. So I get stuck somewhere between, the anxiety of wanting to do more and move faster and the fatigue that leads to procrastination, and those two kind of come together. And it's just a huge clusterfuck. So I think, one thing that I've just come to realize over the years is that's, more of a symptom and not necessarily like what's causing, that emotion, or what's going on psychologically. So you can kind of reflect and be like, oh, where am I in terms of just systemic stresses? And, am I feeling this way today? Am I moving this slow today? Am I performing this way? Am I sleeping this poorly? Am I digesting this poorly? Because I made this, mistake, or just because, I suck as a human? Or is it just because, I'm at the typical point where the wheels, start to kind of fall off? Um, so those symptoms too can also be like precursors to orthopedic symptoms, because as you push those, through those further and further, um, you know, that fatigue could potentially drive changes, in motor patterns. Like it could potentially, decrease performance, but you still want to hit your numbers. So maybe you change, your execution on things, you try to push things a little harder than you should. Um, so I think, catching some of those symptoms outside of just, the physical symptoms are also very valuable. Physical symptoms for me might come in the form of my like QLs, or just kind of my general trunk just feels tight, almost like I did like an ab workout, just kind of like a general stiffness around my midsection. It may come in the form of just like wanting to crack my upper back all the time. Like you've seen me do this, just kind of like
Yeah.
do a lat stretch, QL stretch, and just kind of popping and cracking up there. So just a general like stiffness all over, is a physical sign that I might get. Um, and I know you had kind of like so the second part was like recommendations, to other people of how they could start to identify that. I mean, I think each person kind of has their own signature of fatigue in terms of like what shows up biologically for them, whether it's, digestion, no pun intended, going to shit. It's, a lot of people, it will be just a lack of motivation, increasing anxiety. Again, that can impact sleep. Some people, it may just be that performance, falls off first. That's a pretty easy one to track. And I think, not a bad one, because it doesn't have, a whole lot of sort of long-term consequences to it. But usually there's sort of an order of things, where it's like, all right, I'm okay with a little bit of anxiety, or I'm okay with a little bit of, tightness here. But, anywhere past that point, all right, it's time to kind of like pull back here. I would say yesterday was also probably the first day I've seen performance kind of take a little bit of a hit. And I'm like, I don't know if this was just one workout based on the conditions, or if it's going to repeat itself. So I think like the only way you're going to be able to find what things break on you in some respect is through experience. And I think as much as possible, just trying to look at yourself almost like as a third party, or maybe having like a coach, where you can have a view of yourself that's not so like judgmental, and it's not so like so much as trying to fix or improve something, but just kind of observing it from the outside. And yeah, I don't know that that's something you can just acquire like on, day one, or something that someone can tell you. At the end of the day, I think there is a little bit of a trial by fire there, and it does take some really just honest reflection.
Yeah. I think for me personally, I think an important point in general to make is a lot of the things that you talked about are not often discussed in the context of training, because in the context of training, the question is almost always like, what do I do if I hit a plateau, or what do I do if I'm can progress everything but not this one thing, or it's always seems to be performance related. And it often doesn't seem to be a conversation around like things like your general mood and your digestion. Are you generally more gassy? How are your shits? Like those types of things I definitely never really even thought those thoughts never really crossed my mind. And to some degree, like you said, trial by fire, they don't always need to, because you know, if you're being stupid enough in the gym, it's very often, you know, more of a directly physical thing. But oftentimes, the longer that you are able to push things, the more the symptoms tend to move in the direction of, you know, the everyday stuff as compared to just the, you know, performance based things. For me in particular, you know, with powerlifting, it was always very obvious to me, because when you're dealing with, you know, or when you're attempting to deal with the highest magnitude loads that you can in a way that is almost always very systemically fatiguing, it becomes, you know, those kinds of signals I think are a lot more clear than sometimes in the context of like, oh, you know, on this day my shoulder was bugging me, but like I could just go and do this other exercise, right? Like a lot of times in powerlifting, you don't have that option, especially if you're close to competing. So I think powerlifters kind of have to learn in a much more like you know, do or die kind of a way than bodybuilders do. I often hear bodybuilders saying like, you know, my elbow's been cranky recently, you know, so I'm going to go do cables because cables are, you know, they're constant tension, but like then I'll go back to barbells, you know, when the elbow is feeling better. And so I think it's a good representation of what you're describing more broadly. In the context of what you mentioned about viewing those things as important too, I think that's a totally different perspective for most people. I wrote this article recently on tightness, and just like, because you know, you often hear people say like, oh, my hamstrings are tight or my low back is tight, and that's really just a general description you know, for discomfort. And in some ways it's like a very mild form of pain when people feel tight, or stiff was the word that you used. And I think that, you know, the title of the article in some ways I think it's meant to be like clickbaity, but I think the title was like, why muscle tightness is a good thing. And the point that I was basically just making is, you know, whenever you perceive these kinds of sensations, these kinds of things are representations of a proper function in your nervous system. You know, your brain is essentially just feeding you this information that is trying to tell you something that is very likely an important thing to do. And so much in the same way that, you know, maybe someone who smokes a ton of cigarettes will pick up a cigarette to sort of alleviate that symptom of like, you know, anxiety or something similar. Someone might go and stretch this thing that, you know, maybe is completely unrelated to directly to the muscular system, right? It might be much more of a global thing than that. So I think that concept overall of just viewing the feedback as feedback, and not, like you said, in a way that is judgmental, or in a way that is trying to define the exact why, because we have this tendency to want to label things as, you know, good or bad, and as a consequence we make up these explanations as to why, when I think in reality, you know, there's no clear you know, cause of some of these things, or at least any way to directly define why, you know, your trunk might feel tight, other than just, hey, this is a global thing all the time. So do you have anything else to say on that before we sort of skip forward?
Yeah, I'm trying to recall some of the books that I read early on that just sort of made me favor this idea of like our perception is very far oftentimes from like what reality is. Like the thoughts that we have in our head are not necessarily accurate representations of like what's happening in our body or what got us, you know, to where we are right now. And I think when you can just separate this idea of like my thoughts or, you know, my feelings are representations of reality, but sometimes just like expressions of kind of what's going on internally, you can more easily have like an objective view of what's going on from a fatigue standpoint. But it definitely takes some practice, and it's definitely like, you know, there's no end point to just being like, oh, I can just separate myself from, you know, feeling like shit today. But I think the more you go through those cycles, the more, even though it sucks when you're, you know, in pain or feeling like shit, you have somewhat of a better idea that like it's transient, you
Mhm.
know, and it's not something that's like, needs to be taken away this very moment, and just kind of being able to sit with that, and also realize again that like things can be a symptom, like even thoughts, can be symptoms and not necessarily something that's like an accurate representation of reality.
Yeah, like the kind of thought that you're having, even just, under no volitional, well, not that you could ever really volitionally create a thought. In a sense, it's all just kind of emerging. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I also think another thing that you have talked a lot to me about is the psychology piece, and in particular how a lot of the thoughts we have also emerge as feelings in just like in our physical bodies, because oftentimes like something like anger is very clearly associated, at least with inside of me, with like a chest tightness feeling, or sadness or something, like in my throat, and I think that paying attention to those kinds of things, just on a more broad scale, I think can also often be an indication of like, are you more frequently, in this week feeling like your chest is tight? Not just in one extreme instance, but just across the course of the week. Like, do you feel short of breath? And those kinds of things are obviously much more nuanced to start to pay attention to. I think originally I tried to like, practice that through something like meditation, but I find that, and maybe that was always going to be necessary as a starting point of just like, okay, just close my eyes and just observe what's happening. But to some degree, I kind of feel like it's good to treat your everyday life as a sort of meditative experience of paying attention to what you feel just in your daily interactions, and during your lifts as well, and giving importance to that rather than assuming that it's just a consequence of whatever's happening in front of you. Okay, cool. So yeah, I think that's an interesting piece. What I wanted to talk to you about also was, and maybe there'll be some overlap, maybe there won't, doesn't really matter. But the conversation that you had with Mike Israetel broadly, I think was related to originally at least the concept of failure training and fatigue and sort of timelines of fatigue and those kinds of things. So first of all, kind of what did you guys talk about, broad scopes, and then because I know you and I were talking about a similar topic, earlier in the week or maybe the previous week. So that's something that I also wanted to touch on, was just the concept of like, the timeline of a block and what we consider in terms of the concept of a block. So what were you guys talking about this week?
So, having listened to a good deal of Mike's content, there was always one particular topic that just like really stood out that he was pretty adamant about, that just didn't line up with my experience. And that was really like just how quickly he and his clients would accumulate fatigue in a mesocycle. So he tends to lean towards blocks that are approximately 4 weeks in length. And this is something that was, pretty consistent with like the sports science periodization that I saw in college, where it was like, all right, we're peaking for sporting competition, or peaking for even like Olympic lifting or something, and you go through these periods of like hypertrophy, strength, speed development, and it was like this just textbook like 4 week mesocycles, and I never really knew like where that came from. Some people argue that just came from drug cycles, basically, like
Yeah.
And I guess like in practice, just having watched train with many bodybuilders over the years, there really never was any periodization in bodybuilding per se, like on a purposeful level. The periodization was basically like maybe contest prep is usually about 16-20 weeks, and then there's some brief period of recovery after that. As you mentioned, bodybuilders employ different tools to sort of manage fatigue, whether that be changing exercises, changing rep ranges. When you have a lot of options, you can actually kind of dig deeper into fatigue. I think you see this differentiation in, like, let's take one end of the spectrum of like high force, high velocity, and like Olympic lifting versus like runners. Like true overtraining from like a sports science definition, you only really see in endurance athletes, because it's like, yeah, pretty much no matter what, they can get out there and run. Like your body can just find a way to make that happen. And you could argue, like, evolutionarily that, was more important for survival or whatever. But when it comes to Olympic lifting, it's somewhat binary. Like if you set, a certain percentage of your max that you want to hit and you can't hit it on that day, it's pretty easy, to test. And it's pretty hard to fake that and find a way around it. And then, same thing with powerlifting, like you mentioned, the exercise selection is limited. The numbers are very objective. When you get into something like bodybuilding, the rep ranges are varied. The exercise selection, is varied. Even in terms of like the muscles that you're stressing, it's varied. And the frequency sometimes, can be relatively low as well in a classic bodybuilding template, a pro split, so to speak. So guys pretty much would just like, train year round. Sometimes they're traveling and, their training gets affected by that. Almost like a personal training client would be, where they never like really get a true deload. Their life just kind of cycles it.
Yeah.
But it's not like their performance isn't going up over time as well. So it's hard to say, that like they're not employing progressive overload, because you're not seeing, professional bodybuilders, benching 135. So clearly, progressive overload, is being achieved. So in a classical sense, they're not doing, periodization per se, and the mesocycles, are extremely long, and you could argue that there's a better way to do it. But at the same time, like there's not a lot of direct, evidence to show that either. There's not, good research on hypertrophy training showing that periodization, is significantly better. We don't really see that, in the real world. I think in a practical sense, managing fatigue is a really big deal. And if we call that periodization, cool. Some of my mentors on the enhanced side tend to lean towards longer blocks, like a Broder Chavez, for example, is in like the 12 to 20 week range. And, that's like where I've settled on for the most part. And that's been kind of my experience with myself and, training with others. So, I would hear Mike on a podcast say things like, if I train to failure for, a week and a half, 2 weeks, like the wheels just fall off, I'm crushed, and like, I need an entire week off of training. And, his paradigm tends to be like 3-4 reps in reserve, 2-3 reps in reserve, 1-2 reps in reserve, and then 0 reps in reserve. My experience is also that usually with myself and people that I've trained with and trained, usually by week 3 or 4 is really when people are just starting to hit their stride in terms of being able to, execute the program really well. And just having a good sense of like, not only like if you've changed the exercises, just how to like set them up, how to execute them well, how to pick the appropriate loading. But there's a whole psyche shift, like every time you get into a new program. And I find if you're, changing things too quickly, my experience is that actually tends to be more destabilizing and kind of more difficult to make consistent progress on than just having something that's longer, that you can, get more practice in for a longer period of time, even if that means the progression is a little bit slower.
Yeah. And just to interject and clarify one thing, what you meant by Mike's paradigm of we leave, 3 to 4 reps in reserve, and then 3 to 4, and then 2 to 3 reps, and then 1 to 2 reps. You mean across, weeks 1, 2, 3, and 4, not intra session, right?
That's right. Yeah. So basically, the last week 4, typically,
Yeah.
sets would be to failure, but in week 1, they would be, maybe 3-ish, reps from
Or
failure.
more, probably many more.
So yeah, we just, I told him like, look, this has been my experience. Like, I'm curious if we can, find some potential discrepancies in like how we program that might account for why you're seeing, this, and why I'm seeing, something else. Because, I do believe that, he trains hard, and that, he's very intelligent, and, he's thought this out. So it's just very interesting that he's got such a big subset of people, and so much training experience himself, and that it conflicts with so much of what I've seen in practice, both in myself and in other bodybuilders. And, truth be told, kind of the end of it was just me sort of like straw manning, my own argument, and saying that, like, historically for me, I've, my exercises change maybe every 6 months to a year. Like, not the exercise in its entirety, but like something about it could change simply as I learn more and as my body changes.
Yep.
So that could be anything from like adding a seatbelt to getting a new machine, of the same variety, right? Like, we just got the Strive leg extension in, and before that we were using the Kaiser one, and now I'm training at a different gym. And even if you're going completely to failure on the same exact exercise but on a different machine, there actually is a pretty significant difference week to week in terms of the improvements you can make on the same machine from a different manufacturer versus what you were using previously.
Yeah.
Even if it's just like the first week, you don't exactly know what weight to choose. Your perception can be that was 100% effort, but your output is seemingly pretty different just in a small change like that. So that's like pretty much where we left off. As I said, that could be, one factor that accounts for that. I think a counter to that is I don't think most people are doing like the same exercises, their entire training careers. And especially in these 4-week mesocycles, I think a lot of times the exercises are changing between mesocycles. Like, that's my understanding, is that is one of the things that will change, is exercise selection between those mesocycles. Typically my progression week to week, if it's not something that's entirely new, will just be like a rep, or 2 across all sets. If I did like 4 sets and I got 15 reps, 10 reps, 8 reps, 6 reps, whatever, maybe the next week I'll get 17 reps, on the first set. So maybe I had an improvement of 2 reps at the most, 1 or 2 reps. So they tend to be small improvements across weeks. I did point out to him, when I use some new equipment, that the increases are much bigger. Like, I've been doing leg extensions pretty much since the day I started training, but
Yeah.
I'm using just a life fitness leg extension that I've never used before. And last week, I went up 20 pounds and got the same number of reps. But like, I sent you the video of doing, that was actually the first week that I did it, that video that I had sent you the extension on my Instagram. And it's like, I don't see most people, pushing sets, to that level of fatigue with that slow velocity at the end. Like, it's very hard for me to see, based on watching my own sets on video, that other people are, taking sets closer to failure, or especially with, the profiles on a lot of the machines that I use, the resistance profiles, like, it's, allowing me to really grind out some of these reps at the end. So I think his general perception was like, if you're able to make improvements week after week for that long, you must be training further from failure earlier on. Basically, like, your perception may be that it's failure, but that might not be, the reality. So it's kind of like a hard thing, to argue, right? Because it's all perception. It's like, how do you prove that something is to failure? Because we've both seen people, and this is like kind of a thing that a little bit of beef that I have with the research too, is like, just because someone, can't do another rep, doesn't mean that under different constraints, they wouldn't have been able to. And there's a lot of things that can change someone's perception and also the visual representation of what failure is. And you really have to have a trained eye to know if that was true failure for someone. And even then, again, with me and Mike, it's going to still be open to debate. Like how do you really know that you couldn't? I think the only way would be like, maybe electrical stimulation.
Yeah.
You just like compare the two.
Yeah. So a couple things there. What is the terminology that's appropriate for saying that something it can't be proven true, but it also can't be, non-falsifiable, I think. Does that ring a bell? I mean, it's just the point of, the conclusion of you must not be training to failure is one that you can neither prove nor disprove.
Yeah.
Right. Which is not very scientific. But anyway, I think a big component to this that you and I have talked about a bunch, probably recently, maybe even on the podcast, but it's just this idea of like the trade-off between the hyper aroused state of training and lifting. And, and what I mean by hyper aroused is just kind of like really amped up, maybe vocal, during your sets, shouting at your partners, yelling things like, come on, doing spots, drop sets, those kinds of things that are, much more macho and broy. Those kinds of things are things that I used to do, things that you used to do. And, you've recently sort of somewhat, relatively recently transitioned, not to that sort of style of training.
And it's funny because like I was thinking about this the past week in the gym, is like, as I get deep into the mesocycle, like as I get towards the end of the block, like that stuff kind of tends to like reemerge, right? It's like, I don't, maybe it's because I know I'm at the end of the block. Maybe it's because I'm fatigued and that's what comes out. Like, I do think like also knowing where the finish line is can really benchmark a lot of things, in terms of like, if someone tells you that you're going to only be able to train for 4 weeks, that really, sets a like kind of an anchor, in your mind. And I think the same thing happens for me. It's like, oh, I know this block is 14 weeks, so I think that kind of stuff has a huge influence. Some people, when you're teaching them to go to failure, it's actually better to anchor by saying, I want you to do this many reps, or you just tell them 3 more and then, 2 more and then 1 more or something like that. And just keep kind of like putting that, carrot in front of them. Though, I think the, psychological term for that is still anchoring. But that has a huge effect, I think, on people's perception. And I don't think a lot of that really gets talked about when we discuss things like fatigue, because, some of it is perception, and even that can affect your performance. But, when you're told that, some people just have never even heard, so many bodybuilders have never heard of a deload, like anything for any bodybuilder from like, pre 2010 or something, like you've never heard the word deload before. And that really affects their perception of like how long they can train really hard. And, I didn't follow these guys around, and, some of them, I know personally, and, but the best I can understand, it's like they just went in and kind of trained, as hard as they could until they couldn't. They backed off a little bit, but there wasn't like a clear distinction between on and off, and a clear sort of like plan is I can only go this many weeks and then, I have to back off. Aside from like the dieting side of things. And I think, the drug cycles also naturally kind of build that in, and that again may be part of where, periodization comes about. is just, you have harder training when you're taking more drugs, and you kind of back off, when you're not. But yeah, I know I kind of like interjected there at that point where I was saying I actually do kind of find myself falling back on that. And I guess if you do have a prescribed length of time you're going to do something, oftentimes, at least speaking for myself, I try to fit in a lot at the end, where I'm just like, I just want to find the breaking point. I'm just like, let's just throw in like an extra cut.
Oh
Let's
no.
just like throw in an extra 100 milligrams. Let's throw in an extra couple sets. It's just like, how much can we fit in, before the finish line kind of thing. So that mentality still does come up for me. And as much as I say, like, yeah, I just, train non-emotional, like there are definitely times when there's like no one in the gym on a Saturday or, Friday night or something. And it's like that gets pulled out of me. But it's not the majority of my training.
Yeah, so a lot of ground to cover there. The first thing is just the theme of I love that it works out with the whole anchoring, concept, that it is both. We talk about anchors, the physical anchors, but now we're talking about the psychological anchors and like how you frame something. And that has a lot to do with timeline, like you were saying. And you see that in so many areas. And that is such a big reveal to think about the fact that so much of the way that we do things just in daily life is dependent on like the amount of time or the constraints that you provide for yourself. And I think that, that's also why I personally, I just hate deadlines for some reason. If I'm really far away from a deadline, I'm thinking about how far away from the deadline I am, but then I'm really close to the deadline. I'm like stressing about needing to get all the stuff in and just doing as much as I can right before it. So it is such an interesting thing to think about even outside the context of lifting, but the within context example that you gave about timeline of like a deload, and how if you don't even know that the concept of a deload exists, then a block that maybe could have lasted, just as a random example, 16 weeks may be something that you constrain to 8 or 10, and maybe you train according to that timeline without even realizing it. And that also applies, as we've talked about, on a much more acute scale, in sort of like a microcosmic sort of a way, where, if within a set you tell yourself that you're going to do 15 reps versus if you tell yourself that you're going to do 10, like those are two very different anchoring points. So it's cool to see it apply on the level or at the level of a set, but then also at the level of a block. And then beyond that, at the level of like, just where you see yourself going from a training perspective.
Yeah, like the tempo could change too, right? When you say I'm going to do 15 reps versus 10,
Yeah.
or last week you did 10 and you're trying to hit 11, I guarantee you the reps aren't exactly the same, and that's part of why I've taken up this concept of just doing as many good quality reps as I can, recording that, and then comparing it post hoc, right? Because if I anchor myself going in, I think that has the potential to affect the quality of my reps.
Yeah, for sure.
I know somewhat, and your brain still just comes back to that because I still know like that it's 15 to 20 reps, right? So I already have that as kind of an initial anchor that I know like 20 is the high end. I really don't know, exactly what I did the previous week, but I still know like, 20 is good. Like there's somewhere in the back of my mind that like still kind of knows that. And I do think still as the weeks go on, I probably do have the propensity to kind of like maybe move through things a little faster, probably to do things again with a little bit higher like excitation, and that probably as per this discussion, like just fits into whatever pre-prescribed plan I have, just knowing like I have this many weeks and we're just gonna like push it till the tank is empty basically. And I definitely see that, subtly happen as time goes on. Like shit just gets, really freaking heavy. And then you get to a point where you're like, man, just, I don't know, like psychologically, physically, to do that kind of weight, like even if you can make performance gains on it, you're almost like, man, I just want a week of kind of like, you sort of trick yourself maybe into thinking like, if I just move slower and like refocus, on the execution again, like that's, what's needed at this point. Just because it's like, I was doing the seated leg curl the other day and I had, the 45s, pinned on both sides of the machine. And that was the one on Friday where I kind of like, started to feel myself really, getting up for it psychologically. And I am thinking like, man, next week, like now I'm gonna like pin, another 5 on top of that. And I'm like, how many? There's almost like if the machine. Here's another good. Where I was going with this is another good example of anchoring. Is the machine? I don't know what it holds. Maybe 200 pounds, right? Like our seated leg curl, probably more than that. But let's just call it 200 pounds. That if the machine held 300 pounds, then I wouldn't really think 200 was a lot of weight. But like you're doing the whole stack and you're like, oh, yeah, that's heavy. And then I have to pin all these 45s on top. And I'm like, man, that's a lot, But if they just had a 400-pound stack on there, like I don't think it would be as like, it's great a like psychological and physical feat.
Yeah.
So I think even like the size of the weight stack is a very relevant like anchoring factor because
Yeah.
mentally when I look at the weight stack and there's multiple 45s pinned on there, like that does something to me psychologically. And
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm like, I don't know how many fucking weeks I want to do this shit for.
Yeah, there's also just the reality of the fact that you have to put all that shit on there. And I think that something I've thought about that's more broad in terms of this anchoring thing, like psychologically, is how we all tend to have in higher quantities just like random or seemingly random thoughts, like when we lay down to go to bed. And I think that there's something about going to bed that brings out certain stressful thoughts that is not, or maybe just thoughts about like the next day that, you ever like lay in bed and you're like thinking about how exciting something that you're doing the next day or the following day is or something like that. And it's hard to sleep. I feel like that's kind of another example of that, where your brain knows that like, this is the last stop of the day. Like there's nothing after this, so I don't really need to hold all these things back. And all those things tend to flood to the surface. So I think it's almost, I mean, it would be debilitating to be aware of all of those anchoring effects constantly, which would be in another sense, like another another anchor itself. But the thing that I really want to address from a specific standpoint is that trade-off of that sort of hyper aroused state. So you're saying like, okay, for that leg curl, I could kind of feel myself getting up for it and, just getting into a state that was like, maybe you're letting a few grunts out. Maybe no one's in the gym. Maybe you're shouting. Maybe you're thinking of something that makes you angry or whatever. A couple of weeks ago, I put out this post about failure training and basically how like you don't need to yell and scream like a toddler. And, the intent of it was obviously to get people a little bit riled up about that concept of like, you don't need to yell, because some people are very ironically emotionally attached to that idea. And so, of course, out came like hundreds of people who were very angry that I had said that you don't need to scream like a toddler when you train. They were saying all sorts of things. And in some ways, it was proving the point, right? Like all these people, all these like roided up meatheads were coming out of the abyss, like telling me how I was small and weak and that I didn't know what I was talking about. So like, it kind of like, I didn't need to say anything in some regards, but in another sense, it made me think more about like, okay, what are the sort of points that these people in general are making that are valid? And one of the big points is like, your output clearly goes up, right? But so if just as a concrete example, like if I'm bench pressing or when I used to do powerlifting, I would get like super hyped up in a way that was like calm enough to where I felt like I could maintain technique and not blow my head off. And that would always definitely give me a boost, but I would make sure that I was only really doing that for like sets that were super, super important. And the rest of the sets were kind of just like, I'm focusing on technique, I'm focusing on the scale, blah, blah, blah. And so,
That's
so for me, it was just like right time and place, but it's difficult to find right time and place when you're talking about in the context of hypertrophy training, because to some degree, it's just like, I'm just going to fatigue the fucking muscle. I don't need to fatigue my entire body, to do this set of leg curls. So the question becomes, and really the claim and where some of these things are maybe more supported, is someone will just pull a study out of their ass that says, when the participant lifted this weight, and they were calm and had no sort of angry, yelling intent, they lifted 100 pounds. And then when we got the participant to scream and yell and everyone was hyping them up, then they could lift 125 pounds, for the same amount of reps. So people will pluck that one non-contextualized tidbit into the entirety of their training, thinking that, okay, all of my output will be better on all my exercises, and as a consequence, I will get bigger. But to me, it's like, you just don't, it just wouldn't make sense to me that the difference in that amount of output relative to the fatigue cost would actually make sense as a trade-off long-term.
another one for you here before.
Yeah, go ahead.
So this the word of the day here. When a lot of times when you said, like, with good study design, you want to create initial anchor, and a good example of this is like training to failure. So when they're doing like reps and reserve studies, oftentimes what they'll do is before the study have people train to failure so that they have a good anchor for what failure is. And sometimes you actually need to practice a thing, to get good at it, surprisingly, and to also know, where that exists on a spectrum. So if you have people that have never practiced pushing hard, without high levels of excitation, surprise, surprise, they're not going to be good at it. Number one. So I think that's a really like important thing to realize is like, yeah, I think on a general continuum that more aroused, well, when it comes to like low skill, very high force output things, high arousal, will tend to improve performance. The task that you're trying to, the performance of the type of task is going to really determine how much arousal is going to be relevant for that. So not more arousal is not always better for every type of task.
Yeah.
And also, if you're comparing like a 1 rep max to what I'm talking about here, like a 15 to 20 rep max, the arousal level is very different. You don't want to treat the very first rep of a 15 to 20 rep set, with that level of arousal. And anyone who's done those type of sets will know that you come from a very different emotional place when you do them. So I think that's one thing to consider. Like, what's the rep range that you're using? Two, like, if you just take people off the street and you have them do a task that's very low skill, high force, more arousal is better, but also they haven't really practiced being able to do that without going to that place. And I do think more practice will allow you to bring those two closer and closer together. And I had a third one as well. So rep range, practice. See, this is like exactly how I feel at week 12 out of 14.
It all comes full circle with a real-time demo.
It's so true. Like, I'm feeling it. But yeah, I think at least, having those two, as an example there. The third one I was thinking is, you alluded to this as well, is just like, consider what what the task is and what the goal is that you have in mind. So, for the goal of bodybuilding, it's not really like a performance sport. Like, yes, there is training involved in it, but it's really like a slow burn. It's very much like a just consistently check the box, tally up stuff over time. So a lot of sporting events, and then also, strength sports, powerlifting, Olympic lifting, strongman, etc. Um, when you take that same mentality of like, yes, high arousal improves performance, in those type of sports, and then you carry that over to, trying to get an adaptation in bodybuilding, this hypertrophy adaptation, much like, the mesocycle length, I just don't think they carry over very well. Like, I think bodybuilding is actually something where you are not looking for to be at like a 99 out of 100 most of the time. Like, you're looking to just consistently and methodically just accumulate a very like we'll call it like moderate level of stress. So that's where I would say, like, look, even if you could, get an extra rep or so out of that level of arousal, like, it probably wouldn't be worth it. You actually like you actually don't you actually don't want to pull that last drop out of yourself every time you're in there. You're much better off having like a 70 to 80%. But I don't think that's the same thing as saying like, oh, just leave reps in reserve. Because I think that's kind of the conversation I was having, with Mike is, I guess Mike's side of things technically would be that like, well, high level of arousal, but a few reps in reserve is the same thing as low reps or low arousal or moderate arousal and 0 reps in reserve. And again, I think it's sort of a practice thing. I don't think my 0 reps in reserve looks anything fucking like most people's 2 to 3 reps or even 0 reps in reserve. And I think that would be very obvious, if we watch it. So that would be a very difficult argument, I think, to substantiate, just like visually watching the sets, that like, even if they're, under a high level of arousal or whatever you want to call it, that most people doing that type of a program, that their 2 to 3 reps or 1 rep or even 0 reps in reserve looks anything like what I'm calling, a modest level of arousal at 0 reps in reserve.
Yeah. And I find it I would love to see, how different just this conversation would be in general. And by in general, I just mean like what the kinds of reactions to it would be, where we would be as a bodybuilding industry, fitness industry, whatever you want to call it, if the sort of pioneers of the sport of bodybuilding were like just trained very differently, like trained in a way that was not that, because like the first or a lot of the videos that come to mind like are like Ronnie videos of Ronnie, shouting and other people sort of at the time that he was training and beforehand, like all those guys were those like hyped up, like I'm going to scream guys. And so I think, whether consciously or not, if you're a younger person, like watching those videos and those videos are inspiring, it's like you make this unspoken assumption, you make this assumption and it kind of goes unspoken that like that is what you need to aspire to do. And as a consequence of that, you also assume that there is some degree of direct causation between the screaming and the muscle growth, when in reality, there are so many other things that to me are far more important in that outcome. And it's kind of like, everything works this way to some degree, but it's kind of like how people are now, talking about exercises in general. It's like this notion that a single variable could be something that actually moves the needle, right? It's like what kind of the short form, it's like the curse of short form content, in that you're only really able to talk about one thing for a very short period of time. And by virtue of the fact that you are on a social media platform, you have to magnify the importance of that one thing as much as you can to get attention on it. So, to some degree, it's kind of just, It's kind of just part of the deal. And I certainly have been guilty of it, hopefully less over time, of just putting an overemphasis on any one thing. It tends to be a bad idea most of the time. And I find that, again, there was no more proof in the pudding than when all of the people who felt very strongly about this came out and were very emotional about their response to me, calling them toddlers indirectly. And of course, there was that was intentional to some degree. I just didn't expect it to be such a it's just weird, like to see responses to certain things like that. Like I wouldn't have expected that to be such an emotionally driven thing, weirdly enough. But people seem to be very convinced that that is why they have gotten results. Were you going to say something about that?
No, I mean, I was definitely, thinking about it pretty deeply.
Yeah.
But I mean, just the fact that like you're saying like it's surprising that people who are displaying a high level of emotion in their training, had a highly emotional response to you criticizing their emotion.
Well, it's clearly ironic, but
Yeah,
for some reason I didn't expect it.
yeah. I mean, one of the things I was thinking too is like, um, part of what's confound. I would imagine what confounds all of this is like, people that are going to get highly emotional in their training, like are going to have a highly emotional ties, to that activity, to that goal. And I think a lot of times that's what it takes, to really push something very far, is you have to have, some deep-seated, connection with that thing, some or belief about it, to be able to go to the depths in every area that you need to be successful. And that's largely outside of the gym, just all of the time, preparation, effort that goes into something like that. You really have to tie that to your identity in such a strong way. And I'm saying have to, again, that's just a bias that's coming out for me. That's just like an observation that I've had is, a lot of times the people that you see are actually making high levels of progress are also the ones that are going to become most unstable when things go wrong, in that area. Like it's very, very important to them for some underlying psychological reason. And with that, training becomes an avenue to express that. um but it doesn't necessarily need to be. Like I think that it commonly is, but I don't think it's necessarily requisite. And I do think that it's potentially a detriment as well. Even though you've seen a lot of people survive it, clearly, well. But usually those people are very strong, the ones that are most emotional in the gym. It, at least the ones, I don't know, again, there's kind of some bias there too, because we also see like very, very weak people imitating them,
Yeah.
so I have like a few select examples in my mind, because how many people say lightweight now when they go to lift a weight. So to
Yeah.
your point, like so much of that has just been a product of watching other people do it. And I do think there are cultures, uh, globally, within strength training communities that don't necessarily display motion in that sort of a way. I mean, my understanding is that there are like Olympic lifters that are very sort of mellow, about it, and are doing repeated high percentage of maximum performances without high levels of excitation. That's certainly you know what I learned in school from like an exercise science standpoint, is that you know uh, there's you can do repeated um, you know sort of like high again high percentage of one rep max Olympic lifts, as long as you're not getting super psyched up to do every single one. So there's probably some carryover in regards to other sporting, or in this case, bodybuilding activities.
Yeah, and one of the things I forgot to mention earlier, just this topic as a whole, is I always find it very interesting when I train with people that are not you now, how just how much in real time I see the impact of that kind of hyper aroused state, because I do know a bunch of people who use training as, at least based on their perception, they use it as like that psychological outlet therapy. Like people calling the gym therapy is a little bit cringy to me, but I understand exactly what they mean. And I'll be doing all of the sets that the people that I'm training are doing, and I'm doing them in a way, in the kind of way that we're talking about, just a little bit more calmer and more composed, but in a way that's obviously like super, like no deeper into failure than you could possibly go, like just not being able to move the implement, even with some, momentum based intent, we'll say, like toward the end of a set. And after the workout, it'll be like whoever I'm training with, they're like, oh my God, I'm fucking gassed right now, like totally just, tilted. And, it's not as if I don't feel that at a local level, but it's so interesting to come from a powerlifting background and to be where I'm at now, where before and after training, to some degree, it's like depending on the volume, you get into a little bit of this like mental haze, but the difference in terms of, how you feel after the fact is so substantial to me that, again, I only really see it now when I train with other people that train very emotionally. And it doesn't even necessarily need to be screaming. It doesn't need to be vocalized. It can simply just be a matter of intent and where your attention actually is on. And I find that to be super interesting, especially when you're training with multiple people, because you see how a similar underpinning of like that intention manifests differently across multiple people. Some people get much more irritable. Some people are just like much more happy and they feel like they need to talk more, and they're cracking more jokes and just talking shit. And then other people are just like somewhere in the middle, on that spectrum. But I have found it very helpful just to be able to, and part of it too is kind of now I feel like my assumed role at, like, when I go certain places, like if I go somewhere where people know that I do the biomechanics thing, I'm kind of almost always like in teaching mode now whenever I'm in the gym. So that probably plays another role in just how I approach it. I don't usually train with headphones on so that I can talk to people now, which is something that you do at, times that are usually farther away from the end of a block or a competition or something. But I think this discussion as a whole can be very eye-opening to people that haven't thought about this side of things, because to me it's like something that is so obvious now, but until I met you was just never, it was just a completely different like stratosphere of thought, to just think that. And you always hear the conversation of like, your physiology influences your psychology, or they're the same thing. But this, I feel like, is a very clear example of how big of a role, or just really how closely tied those two things are. And you can observe that acutely, like I said, within a session, but you can also clearly observe it over time, and just, not necessarily in relationship to progress, because there are so many things that are involved in that, but just in terms of timeline of a block and how long you can train, hard long term. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a good stopping point, unless you had any final thoughts, any concluding thoughts here.
I gotta cut it while I'm like, slightly ahead here. I'm just gonna
Yeah,
dig
yeah.
myself and just dig myself deeper.
All right, beautiful.